last guest writes the first question. It's a mystery to both of us, so
All
it's
right,
on you.
Let's see here. It's like I'm about to win an award or something.
It's not going to be a good award,
It's not going to be a good award.
No.
Well, you know.
But there's a lot of money with it.
Really?
Yes, I promise.
What
Promise.
What am I getting?
Hey, you'll have to
I'll
find
figure
out.
it out. Okay. The question: what's the best advice you've been given for dealing with difficult decisions? Well, precursor. I'll put this over there. Back in the day, I was never really good at that. Bad temper and all that. But I would say
You're not supposed to front load the answer.
Yeah. Well, I'm 55 now, and over the last, I'd say, like 15 years, and especially the last 5 without drinking, I've gotten a lot better with that. But the best advice I ever got in dealing with difficult decisions, I've got to give that to my wife. Unlike me, who can be kind of high-strung, high-stress, and not a lot of patience, my wife is like Job. I mean, now that her dad, unfortunately, is gone, she's like the most patient person, I think, that's ever walked the earth. And she had a tough job. She managed 50 people. She was in healthcare. And she told me this, I think, before we even got married. She said, I don't even remember the issue that I was dealing with, but I was dealing with other people, and she said, well, is it the hill to die on? And I'm like, what the hell is that? And he's like, is it the hill to die on? And I kind of thought about it a little bit, and I'm like, no, it really isn't that important. Maybe I should just give this to them, because maybe that'll earn me, the whole Stephen Covey, a couple of, emotional bank account points or whatever. And so now I find myself, having been married to her for over 13 years, when I'm in a situation with somebody else, I think, is it the hill to die on? And 9 times out of 10, it really isn't. But where it's really given me some perspective is when it's that 1 out of 10. You're like, yeah, this is that important. And then it's like, all right, how do I deal with this? And then it's usually, all right, I go back to my wife and say, this is the hill to die on. So because you're
how do I attack it?
Yeah, since you're more patient and you're a lot more even keeled than I am, let's talk about this.
I think there's a couple components of what you said. Most importantly, at the end of the day, we're still talking about just being people. And oftentimes our selfishness, our want to always win kind of overrides. And so we get into these situations where difficult decisions have to be made, especially if we're engaging with somebody else, all of a sudden, before you realize it, it becomes more of a personal battle. Like, I don't want to let you win just because I don't want the perception of losing. Regardless of what your outcome you're fighting for, it starts to become, I want to win. And that ties into what you're saying about that maturity component. And a lot of times for men more than women, it takes those laps around the sun to finally realize I don't need to win every battle. And then equal to that, what you said is, if you're if you're regularly dealing with a person or an entity, if all of a sudden they realize, wait a minute, they're actually pushing back on this one, that reinforces to them, even subconsciously, okay, this one's important. Not, hey, wait a minute, he's yelled, fire drill the last 9 times.
Right.
This is just another time of it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Fortunately, I think the whole, the guy thing, you want to win, you're probably a competitive guy. I know I'm a competitive guy, and you kind of get into that, well, I don't want to back down, I don't want to look like a wuss, hey, this is my deal, whatever the situation is. But I think a lot of times if you could take one step back, and I will say I'm better at it today than I was probably in my 20s and 30s. But not every battle is worth winning.
No. And the old adage is sometimes you can win the battle, but you're going to lose the war.
Right.
And so maybe you give up a battle or two, the perception of giving up a battle or two for the overall win of the war.
Right.
Let's take you way back to the beginning. little young Ken. Where's hometown? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up just outside of Chicago in a suburb called Park.
No one will tell that by your accent.
And I say I used to come out with the accent when I had a couple of drinks, and I haven't done that today. I haven't done that in a while. But I grew up in Park Ridge, which is right by O'Hare Airport in Chicago.
And talk about the family. Big, small, brothers, sisters?
Small. I'm an only child.
You and I share something else besides a bald head.
There you go. See? I knew I liked you.
What'd mom and dad do for work?
My dad was a teacher, and my mom worked for the railroad.
In what capacity?
She was in the office. She worked for, back in the day, she put in 30 years at the railroad. Hell of a pension, by the way. She worked for Chicago Northwestern. And then, well after I left the house, they merged with Union Pacific, and she was able to keep the job in kind of an office environment in kind of the truck yard after they moved all of the Chicago offices to St. Louis. But she put in 30 years, and if I remember, if my dad listens to this, he'll get pissed if I don't get the number right, but if I remember it right, I think my dad taught for 40 years. He taught in the same high school that I went to.
I was going to get to that point.
Which is really interesting. At the time, the largest Catholic high school in the city of Chicago, Gordon Tech, and then well after I graduated, he taught at Loyola Academy up in Wilmette, Illinois. It's one of the northern suburbs of Chicago.
Back to your mom real quick, though. Yeah. The train company, largely freight?
Yes.
So no benefit to the family, like, hey, let's jump on a train and take a trip?
No, it was all, trucks moving and produce and goods and things of that nature. So I never was able to hop on an Amtrak for free or something like that. I probably could have ran after a freight train and jumped on the car or something. I think my mom would be upset about that, but no benefits on that end.
Were you a good kid growing up?
For the most part, yeah. I think I was. I got good grades. I never got into trouble. I don't have any felonies or misdemeanors on my record.
That you've been convicted of.
Or anybody's found out. In fact, I actually hear some of my friends and some other people, they'll tell these wild stories. Like, hey, you remember when we took the car when we were both 12? And I'm like, I would have got my ass kicked. I was like, I never even thought of that. The worst thing that I could ever remember getting away with was breaking a chair when nobody was around and making it seem like I didn't do it.
Did your dad teach at the high school level your whole time growing up?
Yes.
So you had no interaction with him as a young student?
No. The first time I was ever, and I never took his class. But the only.
How'd you avoid that?
Well, at Gordon Tech.
Was it an awkward conversation when you told Dad you weren't taking his class?
No, it wasn't, because he was a street kid. I grew up a lot better than he did, I'm sure. Wasn't there for his childhood, but he grew up in the Humble Park area of Chicago, which, from what I understand, went from Polish to Hispanic, and there was a lot of gang problems, a lot of homelessness, a lot of crime, a lot of things that went on, and I know that he had a pretty poor upbringing. And so he was actually chairman of the religion department for Gordon Tech. So he could choose any classes he wanted to take, basically. And he chose the lowest level classes. He wanted to teach the street kids. He wanted to teach the kids that had a little bit tougher time learning. I was fortunate enough to be one of the smarter kids. So I could never take his class. I was in track 3. He taught a lot of track 1. So if I dropped down to track 1, it would take me out of, the not really benefits, but it would take me out of the program that I was in and so forth. So I could never take his class anyway, even if I wanted to. But I do remember he did substitute for a couple of my classes. And that was interesting. That was really interesting, especially freshman year.
Were you into academics?
In high school, yes. In grade school, no. In grade school, I was I did sports, but I wasn't very good at sports.
What was your sport of choice?
I played baseball when I was in grade school. Not well, except for 1 year. I did pretty well, but ended up dropping out of that. Later on in life, I started playing basketball and never played in college or anything, but I tended to play a little bit better with that. I found out that while I couldn't dribble really well, I found out I was fast, and that helped me out, especially on defense. But no, in grade school, frankly, I got pretty mediocre grades. And, I don't know, we could probably blame the school for that. I do to this day, because I didn't really like it there. But, I went to a really strict Catholic grade school. That even to this day, as an adult, I look back and find annoying and unenjoyable. But
are you of the era of ruler across the knuckles?
Yeah, I first grade, one of the first days that I was there, some kid took an extra candy, and I remember Sister Adolfo grabbing him by the back of the neck, and not just slapping him or hitting him, but just pounding on his back, saying, "Spit it out, spit it out, spit it out." And I remember sitting there, even as a kid, it's like, what the hell am I doing? But it was very, I have conversations with my dad about this to this day, that grade school was very, think this way, do it this way. There was very black and white, almost militaristic somewhat in my mind. But at Gordon, when I went to high school, I did good grades because the attitude was like, think for yourself. Don't just simply take this history book or take this religion book or even to some degree take this math book and just take it verbatim. If you got a question, you think the teacher's wrong, but do it respectfully. But say, you know what? I don't agree with that. And I remember, especially in some classes in my freshman year, having teachers, when they were questioned in a non-threatening way, almost light up. They're like, "Oh, this is good. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to say, okay, well, why do you think that way? You give me the facts, give me the reasoning as to why you think that way." So it's a long answer to a very simple question, but in high school, yes, I did good grades.
Using that jump from the elementary, junior high school to high school, was high school less of the sisters, fathers teaching it and more what I'll call civilians, which kind of encouraged a little bit more of that free thinking?
Yeah. It's as I went through Catholic school literally all the way up into graduate degree because I went to DePaul University. And I will say from first grade to the last day I spent in a Catholic university, the farther you got along, the less priests and nuns were teaching classes. In fact, I think at DePaul, I don't think I even had one priest or nun as a teacher. In a high school, obviously there were some priests. It was an all-boys school, so there were no nuns. It was just priests. But generally, most of the teachers were lay people. And I think that, at the time, this was in the 80s, especially as big and as well-respected a school as it was at the time, most of the teachers, not all, but most of the teachers, especially lay people, most of the lay people kind of felt a sense of pride of working there, that I'm not just teaching at any school, I'm teaching at Gordon Tech, and these students kind of deserve the give and take. They deserve the conversation. They deserve to be able to have their own opinions and be able to delve down a little bit and drill down into some of these subjects.
Any aversion on your part to go into an all-boys school by the time you started getting into your teens?
I probably regretted it a little bit more my junior or senior year. Definitely my senior year, but then you're almost out anyway. Right. But at the time, it's an interesting question. I'm going to give you, because you know from my podcast, I love to ramble, so I'm going to ramble on your show
Please.
too. I remember, I to this day, I didn't I still don't like the grade school that I went to, and I feel it's fortunate that it's no longer around. And I remember thinking, I want to get as far away from this freaking grade school as I can. I don't want to go where anybody else is going. And there were a couple local choices near the house. And my dad was really encouraging me, and I give him credit for this. He was encouraging me, you don't have to go where I teach. Even though I knew at that time, even 7th and 8th grade, I knew because he taught at Gordon, I can go there for free. And, Catholic school is not a cheap deal. Private school isn't a cheap deal. So he was kind of steering me a little bit towards one public school or one Catholic school nearby. But I really, the closest school was a public school, and too many of the people I knew from grade school were going there. And I'm like, I don't really want that. And the Catholic school nearby just wasn't as good as Gordon. And my mom was smart enough to say, well, if you want him to go to Catholic high school, which I know you do, why would you send him to a lesser school and pay for it? That doesn't make any sense. And so, everybody in junior high does, you do the high school visits and you go and sit and you listen to the bullshit. And so
That's only in private school.
Yeah. So it was with public school too. I think we went to Maine South, which was
Really?
the Park Ridge. I think we did. But again, after 30 years of drinking, I probably killed those brain cells anyway. But I remember after a number of those visits, sitting down with my parents and my dad saying, where do you want to go? And I says, I really want to go to Gordon. And I remember just kind of going, all right. Then you're coming to school with me early and da-da-da-da-da. So the thought of going to an all-boys school never really kind of sat with me. It was just, I want to go someplace different. And the idea of going to a school in the city of Chicago, not being in the suburbs, going where literally, except for my dad, I knew nobody. It was actually exciting to me, even without the girls.
So then getting into high school and then coming to the end of high school, what was your plan? Were you already lined up for college, or was it something you had to be encouraged? Like, hey, no, we want you to go to college by your parents.
My parents were very much, you're going to college. And I'm sure, as a conversation I had and an argument with my dad once, if you're not going to college, and you better start thinking about the military real quick. And, I wasn't, I didn't get in shape until I was probably in my late teens, early 20s. So going into the military really didn't, sit well in my head. Don't get me wrong. I honor everybody that's gone in the military. God bless them, because I don't think I could have done it back then. But I would say, my freshman year, after having, in my mind, such a negative experience in grade school and getting pretty mediocre grades, I was kind of just, let's go to class and let's just get grades and let's see how this works. But because my grades were so mediocre, they put me in the middle level of all the classes. And some people may say I screwed up because I did really well in those middle classes. I got all A's the first quarter. And so both my dad and the guidance counselor says, well,
bump you up.
Yeah, obviously, this is too easy for you. We like the straight A's, but, if you're having this easy of a time, then it would behoove you to be in the honors prep class and the honors prep level. And if you're going to do that, you might as well go to the honors college prep level and give that a try. That was a lot harder. I still did okay, but once I was in that college prep, it was pretty obvious, like, yeah, I'm going to college.
You mentioned your dad throughout the military. Was there ever a thought of you for the military or the first responder community as you were coming towards the end of high school and starting to become a young adult?
On the military end, no. It just never crossed my mind. My grandfather fought in World War II, but my dad wasn't in the military.
Sponsorship for this podcast comes from Brothers in Arms USA. They're a veteran-owned and operated clothing and accessories brand that's 100% American-made. Every piece tells a story of brotherhood, respect, discipline, and honor. Deeply inspired by those who serve, those who have served, and those who have paid the ultimate price serving our great country. Whether you're an outdoor enthusiast, a proud patriot, or simply somebody who values high-quality American craftsmanship, they've got something for you. Go check out brothersinarms.com, spelled out fully, brothersandarms.com, and use the promo code TRANSITION20 to get 20% off your purchase.
And I didn't have anybody close to me in my family that had been in the military. We always respected them, but it was never on the forefront of my mind. I did dabble in becoming a firefighter for a little while. And that was somewhat out of necessity and somewhat out of, I mentioned before, I started to get in shape. Well, it's like, can I do the job type of thing? So I had gotten out of college with a finance degree, and that was around 91.
This is your undergrad degree?
That was my undergrad degree. And if for those in your audience that remember the early 90s, we were in a recession. So nobody cared about your finance degree. It was tough to get a job. And I had a job. It was at Citibank, working at a branch, making less than $20,000 a year. I couldn't afford an apartment. I was still living at home. So all of that money went for beer. But
priorities.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, it was pretty fun at 21. Me and my buddies were, all working crap jobs because we couldn't find a good job, and we're all living at home because our parents understood, and we would go out 6 nights a week.
Where does the interest in finance come from?
Originally it was in marketing. And, I had a number of people say, well, anybody can get a degree in marketing. And I had a number of people kind of pushing me towards accounting, which I hated. So I kind of did the compromise of let's do finance because I was interested in the stock market and investing and things of that nature, which I still am to this day. And I said, all right, let's do finance. And I did enjoy it. Maybe not as much as the marketing, but I did enjoy it.
What about the aspect of marketing interested you? What was the draw there?
It was just about, how do you promote a product or service and make money? How do you do the win-win, so to speak? You give somebody something of value that they really need, and you get money in return. To this day, it's a simple but fascinating concept to me. So I think that's what probably really turned me on to marketing back in the day. But finance was fun. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't sentenced to Gitmo or anything to have to get a finance degree. I did fine with that. But
figuratively speaking, it wasn't paying the bills, so you looked down the route of firefighter.
Yeah.
Why firefighter and not police officer?
You're taking me back about 35 years ago, and I'm trying to think of my mindset at the time, but it was mainly... Yeah, I couldn't find a job in finance that I really, really liked. And I had really gotten into lifting weights and running and playing basketball and being physically fit. And I was enjoying that. And I thought, do you really want to be behind a desk? And I said, what if I tried something that was more physically demanding? And, the idea of getting shot at didn't really turn me on. But I was like, I see these firefighters, jumping and running and doing all these things. And also, for my finance standpoint, I had worked at a brokerage firm part-time in college. And there were firefighters that actually did both. That were actually, because of the 2 days off and 1 day on, that they were able to be stockbrokers during those off days if they were during the week and the market was open, and still do the firefighter job. And I'm like, maybe I could have my cake and eat it too. And plus, I wanted to see physically if I could pass those tests. So I probably did at least somewhere between a half to a dozen tests around the Chicagoland area. And I was impressed that physically I was able to do it. Even some of those things that I was kind of questioning myself about, especially the whole, you got to climb a ladder straight up. And I'm afraid of heights.
Oh.
I'm afraid of heights to this day. I mean, literally, my wife could tell you, years ago, we were on a mountain and I was driving. I almost had a panic attack. So I'm not good with heights.
No matter moderate height or are you good 100 feet up, or is it?
If I'm sitting at the top of the Sears Tower and I'm looking out a window and I'm on firm ground, I'm okay.
What if you got to get up against the window?
That's a rough one. I'm not going to do that,
that tilted
bullshit that they got over there. No, I'm not doing that. Literally, like we were just, my wife and I were just in Pittsburgh and we were up on Mount Washington, and they have those little lookout things up there, look over the city, and you look underneath and all there are beams and stuff, and it's concrete and it's not going anywhere, but I'm like, you know what? I don't think I'm going to go out on that. But
what about the Sky Bridge out at Grand Canyon?
What? I've never been to the Grand Canyon.
Oh, well, now they've got a Sky Bridge where you can walk out over clear plexiglass and look straight down.
I won't be going on that. But for the firefighter thing, it was funny because that was one of the things that I was really scared of. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to have to climb the ladder. That's a pretty basic thing for firefighters. And I thought, all right, well, they're going to have the truck. They're going to have it probably against a building or something. Just focus on the bricks. And of course, they don't do that. They put the fire engine, they put the ladder truck
and just
in the middle of a parking lot, straight up. So you're looking at you see everything. You know exactly how high up you are. And then you're like, okay, well, I did all these other things physically well, but you probably know as well as I do that if you don't go all the way up to the top and then come to the bottom without asking for help, it's an immediate fail.
Right.
No matter how well you did it, it's not like, well, we're going to average this out or something. If you can't do this, you can't do the job.
It's kind of a vital component of the job.
So, they strap the stuff on you, and they're really nice about it. And they say, well, if you feel uneasy, just clip yourself, to the ladder. And, somebody like your mommy will come up there and tell you, it's okay, come back down, And I remember sitting there going, I don't care how scared I am, there's no way. I would rather fall off of this ladder and be paralyzed for the rest of my life.
Embarrassment's a huge motivator.
Clip myself to this son of a bitch. I'm going up there and I'm coming back down. So, that was the only time that I kind of dabbled in any type of public safety job. I probably did, one summer, like I said, I probably did 6 to 12 of those. And I still look back on it, and I'm pleased that I did so well physically, because I was surprised. A lot of people that came out for those tests just walked away because there were certain things they couldn't do, whether it was the running or the bench press or whatever. And, to have done all of that. Now, I didn't do too well on the interviews and the psychological, thus I've never became a firefighter. That's a whole different question for you. Probably goes back to that whole problem with the tough decisions and tough issues at the beginning of our conversation.
When they ask you if you like fire, you're like, yeah, I like fire.
Yeah, can I set one right now? Well, it's interesting because, I did it as kind of almost a whim. it was the physical part, and I didn't think about the whole mental part. And
Right.
I think that comes with being 21 and being really naive and ignorant. I would think that I would approach it a little bit better now, although I don't know if I would do as well physically.
So after you gave it a couple runs and they said thank you, but no thank you after you tried the psych and the written test, did you go back towards finance? Because you mentioned your grad degree. So was there an immediate pivot and you, okay, I'm going to go back to college, or is that kind of a process?
It was a little bit of a process. I always kind of thought I wanted to go back for the graduate degree. Maybe it was kind of a competitive thing because my dad had a graduate degree, and I was like, well, I'm not going to not have a graduate degree. I think after I got my MBA, he even jokingly said, now we can have an intelligent conversation. But during college, I always thought, all right, I want to get the graduate degree. I don't know exactly when. But, after the whole firefighter thing kind of fell apart, especially, when I actually had a couple of people say, after the interviews, I don't know if this career is for you. And part of it, somebody was smart enough to see kind of my ego. And, they even told me, says, when the chief says jump, the only question you should be asking is how high. And I remember even at 21 going, I kind of want to do things my own way. I don't know if that's going to fly. But I had an opportunity to get back into stock brokerage, which led into a brief career in the credit union industry, which is basically like a non-for-profit bank for those that don't know what a credit union is. So I did that. And when I was working for, in essence, a banker's bank, it was a credit union for credit unions in Illinois, they had a pretty robust tuition reimbursement program. And I said, well, that's like free money. And, I was pretty successful there. I worked there for 8 years. And I said, well, in my early 20s, I said, well, the later I wait, the less apt I am to go back. So I actually went back at 24 to get my graduate degree and got it. I think I graduated with the MBA in 1997. God, I feel old.
Without jumping too far ahead to kind of keep people online with things, you're actually with the police officers credit union today, correct?
I own the Police Officers Credit Union Association, which is technically owned by Bator Training and Consulting.
Okay.
So after that whole credit union career, and after I got fired, that's a whole different discussion. I started my own consulting firm to do marketing and branding and sales and so forth. And one of my very, very first clients was actually Chicago Patrolmen's Federal Credit Union. And I developed a great relationship with them, one that I still have today. Scott Arney is the CEO. Now it's called National Police Federal Credit Union. He's a good friend of mine and definitely one of the top 5 businessmen I've ever met in my life, probably top 3. And then the only reason he isn't number 1 is because I'm struggling to think of number 1 and number 2 ahead of him. But he and I struck up a great friendship pretty early on, and for those that aren't familiar with the credit union industry, which a lot of people aren't, it's very nichey, it's very cliquey, and they like to have their own little things. So like the firefighters have their own credit union association, the postal workers credit unions have their own thing, teachers credit unions have their own thing, even airline credit unions have their own association. And back in 2003, police credit unions didn't have anything. And I remember having lunch with Scott one time. I says, are you aware of any police credit union association or anything like that? He's like, no, nothing's ever come across my desk. And we both did some research and found that there was nothing. And so we went back to lunch, ironically, at the very same place and said, you want to do this? So he and I created it back in 2004.
Well, you mentioned getting fired from the credit union.
No, we're not going to talk about that. Okay. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, you can talk about that.
But and I'll let you decide if you want to tell the story or not. But I just want to know, what's your pivot point? And you said that was the catalyst for you to create your consulting company. What were you looking to consult, advise, niche part of the market were you looking to get into by doing that, as opposed to just going to another job with another credit union?
Yeah, it's a great question. On the firing, a good portion of it was, my ego and my head. But fortunately, by the time I was 30, I became VP of Marketing and Business Development for this, in essence, Bankers Bank in the credit union industry. Still proud of that to this day, to be able to, have a corner office and, be VP at 30.
Are you still in the Chicago area?
It was actually Naperville, Illinois, which is one of the western suburbs out there. And I got canned, and it did hit me hard, but I thought, you know what? One thing that I'm really good at is marketing and sales. And historically, even to this day, with some exceptions, of course, one thing that credit unions have a tendency to be very bad at is marketing and sales. And I thought, well, that's a niche. I could teach these credit unions how to do it the right way. And in essence, that's kind of how I built the consulting firm.
You talk about marketing, but Navy Federal Credit Union does a pretty good marketing job.
Well, but see, Navy Federal Credit Union is by far the largest credit union in the United States.
But are they only Navy and Marine, or are they all branches of the military?
They are all branches of the military. Navy, Marines, Army, Air Force, Coast Guard, and Space Force, if I remember it right. And actually, that's one of the struggles that a lot of our police credit unions run into in the Police Officers Credit Union Association, because they're much smaller. And a lot of the folks that, you know this, a lot of the folks that become police officers were first in the military and already have accounts with somebody like USAA or Navy Federal. And, they kind of feel, well, I already have Navy Federal. Why do I need National Police, and so on and so forth?
So was growing the police credit union aspect what drew you to California, or what brought you out here?
No, my beautiful wife brought me out here. It's another, you could call it one of my missteps or failures. I was married before. I was married during that other job that I got fired from. And I was married for, I want to say close to 15 years. And rather than go really, really deep into that, it was just two people that weren't right for each other at the end of the day. And I had already started the business and was doing a few things, and I actually had a client out here in California, and happened to meet my now wife, and found ways to make excuses, even though I didn't have a lot of business in California. It's like, well, maybe I can go to California and say, hey, I'm in California, let's go out to dinner or whatever. And so that's basically what brought me out to California, and what is a much longer story than I just gave.
So then how does the journey into podcasting happen?
Interesting. I had been doing the consulting in the POC way for some time. And one thing I've never really been shy of is, all right, if there's something else out there that I could be doing to promote my business, and promote my businesses, especially the POCUA too, then I want to hear about it. So about 10 years ago, I want to say in like 2015, you know how you scroll on Facebook and you see these ads and say, hey, go to this conference, hey, do this, and, your life will be perfect, or, whatever else. I saw an ad for a podcasting class run by Steve Olsher and Alex I know I'm going to get his last name right. I think it's Mandosian. Two really good guys that had done podcasting for a while, even in 2015, and they were teaching a class on podcasting, either creating your own show or getting guest spots on other podcasting shows. They kind of explain, how podcasting had grown. And so I took the class and I thought, wow, this is actually kind of interesting.
Were you already listening to podcasts at that time?
No, actually, frankly, I didn't even know what the hell a podcast was. I probably heard of, this thing called podcasting. But, the class wasn't like terribly expensive, as most of these classes are. They give you a decent rate on the class and then want to sell you 5 other things that are, upsells, which is fine. But I took the class and I thought, I could do this. And so I started, doing a couple podcasts, and Steve Olsher had a program for a number of years before COVID called the New Media Summit, which brought podcasters, people that wanted to be podcasters, people that wanted to be on podcasts all together. A lot of fun, really good program. Wish it was still around today. Steve, if you're listening, bring that back, will you? Don't let COVID kill it. But learned a lot, and I said, I actually enjoy this. I actually enjoy, whether it's just pontificating for like 10 minutes or having guests. And so, it's something I've been doing for almost 10 years. And I think you mentioned the podcast magazine. That was something that Steve Olsher started just before COVID. And I thought, hey, this is interesting. I want to be a part of that. Unfortunately, COVID killed that too. But that's kind of how I got into podcasting.
So coming out of that first event, I want to do podcasting. Did you have an immediate idea for what you wanted your podcast to be?
The first idea was I wanted something that kind of tied to my business. So, my whole philosophy when it comes to helping an organization is what I call brand culture strategy, or B+C+S. What's the image we want to promote? What's the experience we want to create, and how do we drive more of the right business to our business? So I wanted to do something on branding, culture, or strategy. So I started just with YouTube, and I did branding the experience, where sometimes I'd have guests on. Many times I would just pontificate about branding and some examples that I saw. And then I also started Cool Culture Corner to talk about team building and morale and things in different organizations. Frankly, something that I need to relaunch. I haven't done one of those episodes in over a year, and I'm working on some ideas on that. But those were the first two that I started.
And from that experience, what did you find that you really enjoyed about doing a podcast, and what didn't you enjoy about it?
Surprisingly, this will surprise some people, that I actually do enjoy the editing process.
You're the only one.
Yeah, there's even a couple podcasts that I do now for clients where you'll hear very, very little of me and more of them and guests and so forth. And part of that creative aspect of being able to edit and put some music in and, take some of the, usually I always joke with Public Safety Talk Radio, which is the POCUA's podcast, is that when I edit, usually it's my rambles and my stupid jokes and my idiocy that gets cut out, and very, very little from the guests gets cut. But I actually enjoy that. There really isn't an aspect that I dislike. I will say that the part that I find the most difficult is probably some of the same things that other people find, is getting guests. Sometimes I find that with Public Safety Talk Radio, it comes fairly easy. which is kind of surprising. But you go to the SHOT Show, you go to Law Enforcement Survival Summit, it's usually pretty easy to find guests, at least for me. But Cool Culture Corner, Branding the Experience. I also, for a very short time, I did some work with the Credit Union Business News, which was a small trade publication for the credit union industry. And we tried to do a podcast for that where we would interview executives of different credit unions. That was a pain in the ass because I just couldn't find guests. And, granted, the credit union industry isn't that big, but there's still, about 400 credit unions around the country. And there's all kinds of credit union organizations and people that serve credit unions, whatever. Getting people to come on the show was like trying to give birth to a bowling ball as a male. I still to this day, I think we didn't even finish the second season. I remember going to the editor. I'm like, dude, nobody wants to come on the show. And I don't understand this. You would think that some of these CEOs would have enough ego where they want to talk, oh, yeah, I did this, and I did that, but none of that. So, there's nothing that I hate or really dislike about podcasting, but the thing that I find that can be a real grind sometimes is finding guests.
And I misstated it as a hate.
Yeah.
Because...
But it was a good question. Yeah,
but what you're talking about is everything that anybody who has said, you know what, I want to do a podcast, and then they start. And then it's all of the ancillary stuff that nobody ever seems to talk about. Nobody ever seems to talk about the scheduling difficulties. Nobody ever, I'm sure you've never experienced this, that you've set up a guest to come on to an episode and then they just
don't show up. Yeah.
I don't know who would have done that.
I don't know who could have ever done that. Yeah. And you never expect a fellow podcaster,
right,
to do that to you. Somebody, that never, can't even spell podcast, that you'd understand. But somebody that understands the game not showing up. Yeah. But even that happens.
I don't know. I can't imagine what that must be like. If you've read about it in a magazine article, right?
If you know who that could be, you let me know.
Okay. I'll be the first to let you know. But there's so many things that come with committing to doing a podcast. And what you don't realize is once you lay that first episode down, you're creating a relationship. No matter how big your audience is, they're expecting the next one and the next one and the next one. And so there are some times where if you've got a regular release date, whatever it's Mondays or Wednesdays, I guarantee you there's going to be a late Tuesday night, there's going to be a late Sunday night scrambling to get that episode ready to go.
I've been there. More so definitely with Cool Culture Corner and Branding the Experience, which is probably why, fortunately, and for any potential podcasters out there, that's why I like seasons, because then there's an expectation of, okay, there's going to be times where, yes, there'll be a podcast every Tuesday at 9 a.m. Pacific time, and then there's going to be a hiatus like
TV and
like your regular shows. In fact, a friend of mine asked me about seasons versus seasons. I said, I love seasons because they can be as long as you want. Sometimes you got a 20 episode season, sometimes you got an 8 episode season, and that's okay. People understand the concept of seasons, but what you can't do is say, I'm going to have a podcast every Tuesday and then run into some difficulties. Like, well, we're doing seasons now. Start with seasons. And then, if you got enough content, then keep on doing it. But yeah, I think that some people, they get this allure of the podcast, or rightfully so. And I know a bunch of these folks is they think, okay, I have a business, I have to have a podcast. Not always the right thing, but many times it is. If you're an expert in something, it's usually a good idea to do a podcast. But then there becomes the commitment. And what a lot of people, and you alluded to it earlier, and I've got a really good friend of mine right now that I'm trying to work with and help, who does a very, very good podcast. in terms of helping a lot of people and putting a lot of good advice out there. And when he's in front of the camera, when he's has a guest, doesn't have a guest, has the mic on, he does a great job. But then, you know, you got to edit it, and that's the part that a lot of people really hit the wall on. And you can hire somebody, which is fine, but then you better hire somebody good.
Well, and here, the aspect of that is if you're going to do audio and video, how are you getting them your video? Are you doing video in person? Are you doing video remote? That aspect. But then I was going to say the 180 opposite, I'll say. When you're struggling on that Tuesday night to get Wednesday's episode out, and you're just kind of going, why am I doing this? And then you get that text message from a former guest. Hey, somebody heard my episode. They took it and ran with it. They didn't realize I was struggling. Whatever it is, those little nuggets, man, that's like a firecracker, just lighting you off and sending you, keep you going.
Yeah. You know, it reminds me of talking to my dad about teaching years ago. You know, he would say, you know, you don't get that immediate gratification. It happens actually very seldomly, but you do get it. And you get it in very surprising ways sometimes. You know, sometimes it's a kid that you taught 10 years ago that you run into. And it's similar to that with podcasting, because you go weeks, months, sometimes even years without anybody saying anything about an episode. But I've had potential clients that have become clients that say, you know what, I listened to that episode, and it's probably some goofy, obscure episode, you know, one where I didn't have a guest, and, you know, it was that Tuesday night before a Wednesday deadline where I'm like, I got to put something out there. It's like, okay, you know, I'll talk about this stupid crap for 8 minutes. And I'll record it, I'll edit it, and I'll put it out there, and I'll have an episode.
But you might, and I'm sure you're loosely referring to it as stupid crap.
Yeah.
But the thing is that there is valuable information. Sure. And you're hitting that set of ears that found that information valuable. That's the driving force.
Yeah. And the thing is, and you know this as well as I do, because you've said it so many times, you think it's stupid crap. But somebody who really needs it, you know, it may be that one tip, that one thing. It's like, yeah, it's like, I never thought of it that way. That's exactly what I needed right now. And you know, by just putting it out there and having it be evergreen for years and years and years, help somebody. And I've had that. I've had the people say, yeah, I listened to this one episode from 3 years and 2 months ago that, you know, where you made this comment about strategic planning, and it really hit home. I'm like, okay, well, you're going to have to remind me what that was, because I don't remember what I did 3.5 hours ago, much less 3.5 years ago.
Yeah, you definitely can't overthink the process of delivering information, because inevitably there is going to be a set of ears that has not heard that information before. Think about every conference you've ever gone to. Mm-hmm. You've sat and listened to speakers who you thought, oh, I know what this guy is going to talk about. And then they hit that one little piece. You're like you said, I've never thought of it that way. Yeah. And that's how every episode is. Every episode's going to hit a set of ears, and they're going to go, oh, I've never thought of it that way. Yeah. But then the funny thing is I've had guests, and you just assume that everybody knows of all the other big name podcasts. And I've mentioned some podcasts, mm-hmm. Jocko's podcast. Mm-hmm. And I've had guests who go, who? And you kind of wonder, like, how do you not know? You know, and it's just, it depends on where your sight picture is aligned and where your ears are aligned to what you're going to hear and see.
I met Jocko in person. Are you impressed?
Yes, very.
Yeah. You probably won't remember me because it was briefly at one of those new media summits, but yeah.
But he's got a very big podcast with a very big audience, and it's still surprising that it goes to show you how, no matter how big they get, yes, would I love this podcast to grow to the level of Chris Williamson's Modern Wisdom? Mm-hmm. 100%. I think he does an amazing job, and I think he has amazing guests and great conversations. But I guarantee you, even with, I don't know what his subscriber count is, but let's just throw 2 million. Mm-hmm. I guarantee you there's people in this in this country today who don't know who Chris Williamson is and who don't know about the podcast Modern Wisdom. Yeah. So you just have to understand that once you start, commit to it 100%, but understand you're going to be a needle in a stack of needles.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was having this conversation with a friend of mine just a few weeks ago, and it was the same friend that, I was just talking about, who puts out good quality content that can help people. I've listened to his podcast, and I've found things that have helped me. So just, for that reason, it's good to have it out there. And you help one person, it's worth doing. I firmly believe that. But it's that commitment that really that really some people have a problem with, and it's not necessarily a problem with commitment. It's about it's easy to get lost in all the things that you need to do. Really, really easy. It's like, well, I've got these clients to take care of, and I've got this business. Oh, and by the way, my kids want me. It's like, do I really need to do that podcast? He's like, yes, you really, really need to do that podcast because that's a piece of your business.
You've got a lot of coffee options out there. You've got a lot of veteran and first responder-owned coffee companies as well. Trident Coffee is one of these companies, but they're different. Trident fuels your body and mind with a premium cold brew that's infused with powerful ingredients for performance, focus, and wellness. Made with organic MCT oil, lion's mane, and reishi mushrooms, this isn't just coffee. It's fuel for your brain, ensuring smooth, steady energy with no jitters and no crashes. Plus, the cocoa powder adds antioxidants, and the electrolytes keep you hydrated and balanced. Yes, they are cold brew experts, and their beans are brewed for cold brew optimization. But what does that mean for those of you who also love hot coffee like me? Their coffee tastes amazing, not bitter. So enjoy it hot or iced, mixed into your protein shake, or take it on the go. However you drink it, Trident Coffee is coffee upgraded. Get yours now at tridentcoffee.com and use the promo code TDP15 for 15% off your order. That's TDP15 for 15% off your order. Stay sharp, stay fueled, stay ready.
Today, and so many people talk about this. It's when you have your own business, it's almost like creating your own media company. So you have articles out there and videos and podcasts and pictures and all that other stuff. And that's all your branding. Even you may not think that it's important today, but I know that I've gotten clients just from the standpoint of, maybe I have reached out to them, and this is what I tell people about podcasting or YouTubing or blogging or a combination thereof is, will it be a silver bullet? Absolutely not. Only if you're lucky, or if you're Jocko or Joe Rogan or something. But what it's done for me, and it does for most people, and you may speak to this, is that it shortens the sales cycle considerably. Because in the past, when I first started consulting back in 2001, you'd have a phone call, and then you'd go have a meeting, and then maybe you'd have a lunch and another phone call. It's like, okay, well, can you do a proposal for me? Okay. So, after like a 6 or 7 point process, now you have a client. Now it might be like one Zoom meeting. And it's like, all right, well, tell me what you're looking for. Tell me what you're trying to accomplish. And usually that one sentence, well, tell me what you're trying to accomplish, is a good starter, and let them talk. And then I'll say, well, I can help you. Here's a couple ways I think I can help you. Why don't you listen to these 2 podcast episodes I did and this video and read this article? It'll give you a really good idea of my foundation and how I would approach it. If you like what you saw, heard, and read, then let's talk again. Let's do business. If you didn't, that's fine, because I may not be the guy for you, and I could live with that. I'm not for everybody, surprisingly enough. But what that's done, the beauty of podcasting and doing that kind of content, in my mind, really shrinks the sales cycle.
When was the pivot for you? I know you said that Public Safety Talk Radio is a direct component of the credit union.
Or the POCUA, yeah.
What I guess where I'm getting at is to go from consulting type, advertising, informational type podcast to being, I know it's still information based, but it's more definitely focused. And then you even mentioned doing the podcast where you went up to Washington. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the name. Where you interviewed the lost their partner.
Facing Evil.
Facing Evil.
Yes, Facing Evil, yeah, up in Sacramento.
How are you, where I'm going is, where are these pivots coming from, taking you down these very specific rabbit holes for content for your podcasts?
Yeah, I don't see it as a lot of. Some people may see it as pivots and rabbit holes. I just think of it as embracing entrepreneurship. I've always, if it's something that I think that I'm gonna enjoy. Yeah, there's kind of a saying in the whole entrepreneurship, small business world is, if I'm going to do it, it's got to do one of two things. It's got to make me happy or make me money, or hopefully both. If it's not making me money and it's not making me happy, it needs to be deleted from my life. It's kind of how I felt about my first wife. But anyhow, you can leave that in. That's fine.
I thought you were going to go, that was the podcast, Facing Evil.
Yeah. But, I've just been very passionate of, if it aligns with what I'm trying to accomplish. And not only, if I can make money on it, I mean, because I haven't made a direct, you mentioned Facing Evil. I haven't made a direct dime off of Facing Evil. But what it's done is, I was very passionate about getting that story out there. I felt that I had enough expertise from a producer standpoint to be able to put out a quality product. And National Police Federal Credit Union, who did give me the time, and I am on a retainer with them. I said, I'll do this under your name. Just give me some resources to be able to do this and help me promote it, because you mentioned before, some of the things that you dislike. The promotion part of podcasts is a real uphill climb, because you mentioned the needle in a haystack. Getting people to notice, your show is a challenge. So I needed, the National Police Federal Credit Union or somebody to really sponsor it and put it out there. So I said, look, I've got this retainer with you. We're looking for new ways to promote the National Police Federal Credit Union brand. I have a great story. Unfortunately, the story's out there about 2 officers losing their lives. I'm not happy about that, obviously, but the story needs to be told. It's a great book. Let's put it into a podcast. Let's do it respectfully, not only honoring these 2 gentlemen that lost their lives, but also talk about the trauma, talk about what these other police officers that did survive go through even today. So to me, it wasn't necessarily a pivot. It was, 1, I'm passionate about it. 2, my job is to help promote my client's brand, which is the National Police Federal Credit Union. And I just felt, well, this is a great intersection to be able to do both, to tell a story that needs to be told, and to do that in a respectful way by also promoting the National Police Federal Credit Union brand. So, I chalk that up to entrepreneurship, as just finding, these different ways to be able to do things.
When you did Facing Evil, were you already doing Public Safety Talk Radio?
Yes.
So was the mindset to do something like a Facing Evil, to do a season, to do a short segment, total story, and then move on to the next story when the time came?
That's a great question. Well, to give you a rambling answer, like I love doing, I started Public Safety Talk Radio right after COVID hit, because I wanted a way to continue to promote the police credit unions and the POCUA, and to be able to engage with them, even though we couldn't have a conference and couldn't do a lot of things that we would normally do. So I had already gotten into podcasts. Like, well, I can do a podcast, even if I can't frickin' go outside. I could do a podcast. So I did that. And if I remember it right, that's how I kind of came across the story of Facing Evil. And got a copy of the book. And I remember reading it. And at the same time, I was covering true crime for Podcast Magazine. And I thought, this is a true crime story. This is not only a true crime story, but a true crime story with a police officer foundation, which is not your usual true crime story that really needs to be told. And so I went to the authors and I said, this really should be a podcast. The story lends itself well to that medium. And we went down a couple of roads in terms of, well, maybe we could hire somebody, maybe we could do this, that, the other thing. But you fast forward to, say, 2024, and the National Police Federal Credit Union had hired a really sharp young guy for marketing that kind of understood. It's like, hey, you know what? Podcasting is a way to get the name out there, and I like this idea. Let's roll with it. Let's give you some resources. Let's help you out with this. So that's kind of how the whole Facing Evil thing came. And to answer your question of seasons, is we did do 2 seasons of Facing Evil because it lent itself to 2 seasons, the story. The first season is about the day. And I highly encourage you. It's Facing Evil, a cop's story of murder, mayhem, and the aftermath, because there's a ton of Facing Evils out there. The first season is about that day, October 24th, 2014. And that's the day that Bracamontes killed 2 police officers in Sacramento County and Placer County. And that day was so chaotic that we spent the first season just on that day, from the time that started to the time that they caught him, and a little bit of the evening. And then season 2 was more about that aftermath of how do we deal with this. And one of my favorite parts of that story is the trial, as how hard the trial was on everybody. And that was one of the motivations of doing the Facing Evil podcast, because I had covered so many true crime podcasts, and they were a lot of good, don't get me wrong, a lot of good quality, well-done true crime podcasts with facts and good opinions and coming from the right place. But a lot of times, like, okay, we caught the bad guy, and everybody lived happily ever after. Listen to the new season, or the next episode. And season 2, especially the trial, talk about, well, we caught the bad guy, and life still sucks. This is still bad. In fact, in some ways, it's even worse than the day that we caught him, as chaotic as that was. And I think it helped to not only put a good story out there, a story that needed to be told, but is Scott Brown, one of the authors and the officer who lost his partner in this, will say, if people that aren't in the law enforcement community, some of those people that may be on the fence, that like, I don't know if I want to support police or not, actually listen to it and say, yeah, I didn't really realize everything that they go through after the incident, that's almost more traumatic than somebody actually shooting at you.
There's a part of me that really finds digging into a story like that, it's got to be really interesting to kind of start overturning all the rocks and everything and really giving people the complete story. But, and I'm like you mentioned, you did do interviews. There's, for the selfish side of me, I'm all about this. I'm all about just these conversations and seeing where a conversation goes. And where I'm going long-winded with this is that's the joy of podcasting. Yeah. There are so many different aspects that you can get involved in and do. And even if somebody, like I said, it could be another true crime one, but you do it a little bit differently than the next guy, and find where your passion is and lean into it. Taking that aspect and going to the Public Safety Talk Radio what was your mission for that podcast, and what are you hoping and what do you intend to put out with that podcast?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, just to take a slight offshoot on that and then get back to your question, what you said is so spot on, because a lot of podcasters, they either go into podcasting with this idea or they find this out later that they want to learn. And they learn so much from having guests on that it's like you're almost getting a graduate degree just from doing the podcast, depending on the guests that you have. I feel like I've gotten multiple degrees from the podcasts that I've done because I've learned so much. But to get back to your question, which is the purpose of public safety or the mission or what we're trying to accomplish, is before COVID, we talked about the POCUA, and I actually hired a consultant for this to say, well, where can we take this to the next level? And to make a long story short, we talked about, well, the PO is more important than the CU in the POCUA. Not everybody in the credit union industry agrees with me on that. Some feel insulted. I don't care. Certainly nothing wrong with being a credit union. There's purity and there's value in that. But the fact is, in most of the smart CEOs of credit unions out there agree with me, is they don't need you. They can bank. Right now, I literally can pick up this little device and probably open up 10 accounts. They don't need a credit union, but they should want to do business with you because of what you stand for, whether you're just for police or just for firefighters or like Navy Federal, just for military. Makes perfect sense. So in the concept of the PO is more important than the CU in the POCUA, how do we concentrate more on that police officer aspect? Whether you're a credit union or not, if you're serving police officers or other first responders, how can we kind of bring you into that circle? And what was born out of that was a concept called the Soundness Initiative. What do police officers and first responders really need? Well, they need physical soundness. They need emotional soundness, or mental or psychological, however you want to put it. 3, they need professional soundness. They need to be good at their job. And 4, financial soundness, because if you don't have financial soundness, a lot of times those other 3 get screwed up. And we've seen this more than I'd like to say. So the whole premise of Public Safety Talk Radio was, well, since we can't do conferences during COVID and we can't do some other things, we certainly can use the Soundness Initiative and those 4 pillars as the foundation for Public Safety Talk Radio. So every guest that I have on Public Safety Talk Radio has to represent one or more of those pillars. So I know your podcast, the conversation we had went out today, and I believe that was under the professional pillar, because transition drill, how do I transition professionally from one career to another? Perfect topic. Perfect. Once you came on, perfect guest, perfect guest for.
I'll write you the check later.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Perfect guest for that podcast. So, Public Safety Talk Radio is all about, let's get guests on that are going to talk about physical soundness for first responders, emotional soundness for first responders, professional soundness, or financial soundness, or a combination thereof.
Getting deeper into that, have you found that, I'm trying to think how I want to ask this question.
Sure.
I'm sure you've experienced this interviewing guests. They say something and you're like, okay, I'm ready for that question, but now I want to ask this question first.
That never happens to
never,
me, Paul.
Never,
no,
ever.
I always stick exactly to the script.
Do you find that the guests you bring onto the show, do you try to aim to hit more pillars, or is it better to focus on just one of the pillars? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And Go ahead.
I guess where I'm going with this is, do you ever find guests who hit all four pillars
I have.
really well? And is it from one career, or is it because they've done multiple things that they hit all four?
It's seldom that I get a guest that hits all four. When I do, it's usually somebody that has been in a first responder role that can speak to the professional aspect, and then does a couple other things. Maybe they'll do like a mental health, where the physical part will come in too, as well as the emotional, and then we'll end up talking about finance somewhere down the line, either with my background or the guest background, and then we'll hit all the four pillars. That's usually when it happens. It's probably I've got over 100 episodes of Public Safety Talk Radio, and if I had to really take a guess without looking at it, it's probably less than 5.
So for the most part, your guests are, in your mind, when you're bringing them on, you're thinking one of the pillars.
Correct.
And then depending on how the conversation goes, you're like, oh, wait a minute. And then pivoting and hitting the other pillars.
Yeah. Usually it's kind of like just an inner excitement with me is I hear about a potential guest. And we'll edit that out. We'll use you as an example. Shiloh is a mutual contact of ours. Got to know her through Podcast Magazine. Actually.
Now a mutual guest.
And now a mutual guest. And so,
she was my first episode.
Awesome. That's an awesome first episode, by the way.
I strong-armed her into it because she was also a trainee of mine.
Yeah, she really didn't have much of a choice. Yeah. So what am I going to tell my former FTO? No. But I had reached out to Shiloh about something, and she brought up your name and talked about your podcast. And before she even said, "Hey, Paul should be a guest on your podcast." That was just the first thing that came to mind. It's like, he does a podcast. He's a retired police officer. He helps first responders. He needs to be on my show. Yeah, I know he's going to hit at least one of the pillars. So he needs to be on the show because it's just going to be a good conversation.
So let's go back to business side of the house, because leaning more into this podcast and the aspect of transition. If somebody's interested in the business that you operate in, the world that you operate in, consulting, marketing, what advice do you have for getting into that? And can somebody come from that first responder or veteran world and really lean into that in the consulting space?
Absolutely. I'll answer the second part of that question first, because the episode before yours, I had a perfect example. His name is Chris Luttrell. He runs, I know I'm going to get the name of the business wrong, but it's Gravity Leadership and Training, something of that nature. His name, I got the name right, Chris Luttrell. He's a retired law enforcement professional up in the Yakima, Washington area. Great guy, and he does a podcast. He does a lot of public speaking and talks about leadership. And obviously, I know that he works with a number of first responder organizations on leadership, but he also works with businesses. Leadership is leadership. If you can have that foundation and speak to that topic, then you should be able to do that as a former first responder, whether it's EMT, police officer, firefighter, what have you. In terms of advice, is I would say have one piece of foundation. One solid foundation. And it doesn't mean that it can't change. It changed for me a little bit. It morphed, but it morphed naturally. Originally it was about marketing and sales for banking. I knew that. I could speak to that. And then it grew more into branding and strategic planning and so forth. And that's a story in and of itself. But that kind of happened naturally on a journey. But I didn't start off with, I'm just going to be a consultant. And back in the day, I haven't done this in a while. Frankly, I should probably do this again. But I used to mentor college students in undergrad. And they would come to me and say, I want to be a consultant. Like, okay, well, what do you want to consult on? And it's like, well, I'm getting this degree in, basket weaving. I want to consult on rocket science. Well, that, obviously I'm being very facetious and, as my Chicago friends would say, being a jag-off in order to make a point. But it wasn't that far off from that. It was like, well, you want to be a consultant. All you really have is a degree and a resume that says Carl's Jr. on it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But how are you going to go to a small business owner or an executive or a chief of police and say, hey, I want to consult to your team on X? You need to have done it. You need to be able to say, hey, this is where I had success.
What is the grind? It's not just a routine, but the decision we make to wake up, give everything we've got, then find a way to go further. Grind, spelled GRND, is more than a brand. It's a movement, an emotion we all feel connected to as we work daily to pursue our goals and support each other. Founded by a former Army Ranger, Grind Activewear has a clear mission to give 100% and then some more in sport, fitness, and in life. Functional, high-quality performance wear that's rooted in American culture, because you demand gear that outworks the rest. Whether you're on the field, in the gym, or building your own lane, Grind is for those who refuse to settle. Go check out thegrindcollective.com and tap into something bigger than clothing. And while you're there, use the promo code TRANSITION15 to get 15% off your purchase. You're likely already on the grind. Maybe you just don't realize it yet, but the grind continues.
And fortunately, in the time that I spent in the credit union industry, I had success. I increased sales. I promoted products. I had numbers that could say, hey, I did this. And because I did this before, I know how to help you do something similar.
Staying along the lines of business and going deep into the actual credit union aspect. For somebody who's listening who is a first responder and is interested in maybe joining the National Police Officers Credit Union, what information do you want to make sure they know about? Can they join if they're, no matter what state they're in?
The National Police Federal Credit Union is one of our largest in the Police Officers Credit Union Association. Long story short, if they are in the United States, odds are they can become a member of the National Police Federal Credit Union. I always suggest go to their website and see about your eligibility. There is a little nuance in that, but it's not even worth talking about. But if you go to my site, which is just simply btcinc.net, there is a POCUA section on that, and you can go and you can find police credit unions out there. There's a great one here in California. It's Police Credit Union of California up in San Bruno. So I encourage you, whether they're part of the POCUA or not, there are probably about 50 police credit unions out there in the country. I would encourage you, regardless of what it is. If you're in Indianapolis, there's Professional Police Officers Credit Union. If you're in Kansas City, there's Public Safety Federal Credit Union, I believe they are. If you have one of those credit unions, I would say check them out first if you're looking for some type of banking product or banking relationship. Many times they're the best. Sometimes they don't have the best rate. They should by credit union standards, but what you are going to get more times than not is somebody that gets it. And this is one of the things that we do in some of the ads with the National Police Federal Credit Union. And I think it's the same for Police Credit Union of California or Police Federal Credit Union of Omaha or what have you, is if you're in law enforcement, if you're a law enforcement family, do you really want to trust your finances to somebody that you don't even know if they support police? Probably not. If you go to a police credit union, the people there, many of them are people that have family members that are police officers. The boards are all made up of retired and active police officers. They truly have your best interests in mind. Will you always get the best rate or the bells and whistles? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the credit union. But I guarantee you're going to have people that care and that understand the job that you're doing.
Do they have to be active duty members to join?
No, not necessarily. Like, for instance, the National Police Federal Credit Union, because in credit unions, they have fields of membership. That's kind of a technical term. But the National Police Federal Credit Union has a field of membership of the Fraternal Order of Police. So if you're active or retired police officer and a member of the Fraternal Order of Police, you can become a member of the National Police Federal Credit Union.
What about other first responders, firefighters, or do they go down the firefighter route, EMT, that type thing?
They do. Many police credit unions will serve more than just police officers. For instance, the Police Credit Union of California also has some field of membership up in the Bay Area to serve firefighters and EMTs as well. But for those firefighters out there, there's some great firefighter credit unions out there. In fact, there's a few more of those. I think there's about 50 police credit unions out around the country and about 70 firefighter credit unions around the country.
Why is there more firefighter?
You know what? My police friends are probably going to be pissed that I'm going to say this, and some of them will agree. Firefighters have generally a better time with their finances. And I think it's maybe the nature of the job or what have you. But yeah, I think even Nick Doherty at Financial Cop would probably agree with me that maybe it's because a lot of them have other jobs and the firefighter thing or what have you. But firefighters have a tendency to be a little bit more diligent with their finances. I think police. And I've worked with police credit unions for over 20 years, and I've worked with a lot of police officers, and I've heard this more than once. You may speak to this, is that a lot of them have this attitude of, I could get shot and killed tomorrow. And therefore, I want the RV, I'm buying the RV. Something could happen to me next week, I've got 2 sons. I want the boat. I want to go fishing. I'm getting the boat. But you only have a 300 credit score. I don't care. I'm getting the boat.
My limited experience with it is, I think both of us, law enforcement, firefighters, for the most part, we are all about that new shiny toy right now.
Maybe,
but if your experience is that firefighters tend to be a little bit better off financially, I'm sure there's something to the, hey, I work 3 days and I got 7 days off and, I'm going to go. Because I always joke that firefighters are the best at that side hustle.
Yeah.
Get that side hustle. Because one of the things I'm big on is, if you can, set up your side hustle while you're still finishing out this career. Get it up and running as best as possible so that when you do transition out, retire, whatever it is, you're not now starting that business.
Yeah.
Maybe that business isn't going 100 miles an hour. Maybe it's not bringing you all the income that you need, but at least it's established and you can easily ramp it up. Yeah. It seems like firefighters do that better in their careers.
Yeah, and obviously I'm talking vicariously,
right.
And in very, very general ways. I know firefighters that are struggling financially, and I know police officers that, own 2, investment properties. So, it's very general, my comments. But I think that the nature of the job sometimes has influences a little bit. I think a lot of times police officers, they'll have those side gigs, but they're more like, I'll do security, I'll do these things to make some extra money for my family and everything. Whereas with the firefighters, and I know some that do this well, I'll do tile on the side. I'll do carpentry on the side, as I'm hitting your mic here. I'll do carpentry on the side. I'll do some woodwork, whatever it is. That's more of a hobby that can turn into an actual business later on or create some cash flow. Whereas for the police officer, it's more of, okay, how can I pay for the next vacation beforehand by working overtime or doing that extra job.
Bringing it back to personal, you've told the story or you've mentioned the stopping drinking, starting out as a young kid, drinking a lot with your friends, and then having stopped. Is there an informational component to that storyline that you really want to get out about your venture or your adventure with drinking and then stopping?
You know, there certainly there is. I'm not shy about sharing that. For the same purpose of podcasting. If it helps one person, then it's worth talking about. Ironically, I didn't drink a lot as a teenager. I didn't party a lot as a teenager, and I went to college, while living at home. I went in Chicago, so there wasn't a lot of that. I didn't really start drinking until I was in my early 20s. In those meetings, there's people talk about this phrase of I started drinking, and at first it was fun, and then it was fun with consequences, and then eventually it was just consequences, and that is a pretty good synopsis of my 30 years of drinking. It was fun, and I got a lot of great stories, some that I'm glad I survived, and then others that, were stories, but not great stories, and then it was just a hindrance. The thing that I share is, I probably knew that I had a problem with alcohol for about at least 3 to 5 years before I stopped. And one of the things that kept me from admitting that, hey, you know what, I need to make a change. Even lesser than I need help or I got a problem, or just, kind of say, I need to make a change. And the thing that really kept me from doing that for so long until something catastrophic happened and I really hit bottom was, everybody's going to think I'm a piece of crap. If I say, hey, I'm an alcoholic, I got a problem, my parents are going to, be disgusted with me, and I'm never going to talk to them again. My friends are going to say, oh, you can't hold your liquor, you got a problem. It's like, oh, I don't even want to hang out with you anymore. My clients are all going to say, it's like, oh, you're a filthy alcoholic. I don't even want to work with you. And, my wife's going to leave me and all this other crap. And the thing that I tell people over and over again, and I think that if there's one person out there that needs to hear this, please hear it loud and clear, is when I did decide to make a change, and I did accept that I had a problem with alcohol, and I did put that out there, nobody left. I didn't lose any friends. I didn't lose any clients. Still married to my wife. Didn't lose anybody in my life. And with maybe, one or two really minor exceptions, everybody fell into one or two buckets. Either the bucket of like, yeah, I'm glad you're getting the help you need. I'm really proud of you that, you're sober for a whole year, that you're sober for 2 years, that you're sober for 3 years. I'm really proud of you. That's really great. Or they fell into what I call the apathetic bucket. It's like, oh, okay, you're not drinking anymore. Well, I'm going to have a beer. You have whatever you want, and we can still hang out. It's not going to keep me from drinking, meaning somebody else. They just didn't care. So, for those folks, it's like, wow, what are my kids going to think? What are my friends going to think? It's like, odds are nobody's going to leave you. And if they are, it's probably better for you anyway.
I was going to say, you get two good things. You stop drinking and you I don't want to say lose a friendship, but maybe you get somebody who's also toxic out of your life.
Yeah. Yeah. Fortunately, I found that there was nobody toxic. There was nobody that says, oh, you're no fun anymore because you're not. I didn't have any of that. I know some people do run into that, and that's unfortunate. And, every once in a great while, I've been sober for almost 5.5 years, and I only need one hand to count how many times this has happened where somebody says, it's like, what, you don't drink? Come on, have a drink. I can only think of 2 instances right off the bat where that's happened. It usually be in the Chicago smartass that I am. I'll say, okay, well, I'm an alcoholic, which means I got a problem with alcohol. You want to go to my diabetic mother and say, hey, have a whole piece of cake. It's like, do you go to somebody that's got lung cancer, say, hey, here's a pack of cigarettes. Really? And then they kind of get it.
But you bring up a great point, though. Think about our society. Alcohol is the only drug where you have to make an excuse for why you don't do it. Nobody ever goes, hey, I'm not going to do cocaine. Why aren't you doing cocaine?
Everybody's doing cocaine.
But if you tell somebody, hey, I don't drink, why don't you drink?
Yeah.
It's just kind of funny sometimes when you think about the societal implications or the pressures that come with drinking.
Yeah, and maybe it's because I'm not drinking, so I notice it. But there is a huge no drinking society now. I mean, you can go into a bar and they got mocktails and, Guinness Zero, by the way, is really awesome. Those Guinness people, did it right. You got all kinds of non-alcoholic beers and, I can't pick up Facebook without seeing, hey, try this non-alcoholic relaxer or whatever. I don't know what kind of crap's in it or whatever. But, I think it's become more mainstream to say, I think there's a lot of 20-somethings that either have accepted or embraced a no alcohol or a low alcohol lifestyle. And I think part of it is fitness, part of it is, hey, I don't want to lose control or what have you. So, I'll tell you,
I thought you were going to say, I don't want to lose my hair.
Lose my hair.
I was like, is that why I lost my hair?
Yeah, I think it's just hereditary, but glad I didn't lose my life drinking. There's some stories there, but putting yourself in places you just shouldn't be.
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah, they talk about, people, and I've never taken drugs, to my knowledge, unless I was that drunk that, somebody gave me drugs and I took it. I don't remember it, but I've never done cocaine. I've never even smoked a joint. I've never done marijuana, heroin. I hate needles, and then you got to have the lighter and all that crap. Yeah. So I never did drugs. And drug addicts at some of these meetings, you'll talk about the places that they went to get drugs. And I thought, that's nothing. And you should have seen some of these bars and some of these places, these neighborhoods that I went into, to get a $2 vodka soda, for Christ's sake.
The other aspect of it is when you look at alcoholism or the amount of drinking and how I would say definitely more prevalent it was when you or I were younger.
Yeah.
And then you talk about the younger generation today and less drinking. If you really want to go down into a rabbit hole, start doing some research on the amount of less drinking or the lack of drinking that's going on in this country and the impact that it's having on the alcohol industry. All you got to do is look at how many microbrews are going out of business, all because people are changing. The greater majority of the culture is drinking less and less. And like you said, now what you're being presented with is the option of being able to drink. You say it's really good. I don't know if I trust you or not on a Guinness or not. There's certain beers where it's like, I'm not going to go there. But what I'm getting at is they're still giving you the option to enjoy the taste with no alcohol, all that kind of stuff. So it's only going to continue to where I really think it's going to be almost like cigarettes, where try to think about the last time you saw somebody smoking a cigarette. Like, I have to really kind of think about it because you don't see it as much anymore. And I do think as we keep going forward, it's going to be it's just drinking is not going to be as common.
Yeah. Well, a couple things on that. And I saw somebody smoke a cigarette outside of the Pechanga Casino today.
Okay.
But that's probably only because,
you were at a
outside a casino. Yeah. But on the business side, being a business guy, you see all of these beer brands come up with an NA option. And they're not going to create that.
Unless there's a demand.
Unless there's money to be made, and there's money to be made. I mean, there's even Athletic Brewing Company. They only do non-alcoholic beer. That's all they do, and they're making money. Or at least making enough money to stay afloat. I haven't looked at their financials, but they started it based on just a non-alcoholic brew. So the fact that businesses are making money at it or feeling that they have to have this product tells me that that's a mainstream in society. And I think from a good thing, in thank you God that I never got a DUI and never killed anybody, drinking, because I really, really could have had done that. No question about it. I think that all of the anti-DUI, the pro don't drink and drive, I think has finally really sunk into a lot of people. Even if it's just for maybe not the right reason of I don't want to kill myself or somebody else, it's the I don't want to spend $10,000 plus and wind up going to jail. That the stick, the stick has become so big that it's actually being effective, I think.
Hey, whatever causes it is a positive.
Yeah.
Now the other aspect though is with this whole autonomous driving vehicles and the growth of that. If they ever get to the point where you can be in a vehicle that's being driven and you're the only one in the car.
You know what, Paul? I think I would rather drive myself drunk than be in a vehicle that's sober, that's driving itself. Maybe it's the control freak in me or the not trusted technology enough, but that scares me more than going off the wagon.
To bring it to a close, any pieces of any aspect that we talked about that we didn't hit enough on, or you want to make sure people know about you, about the podcast, about business, anything at all?
Just given the foundation of transition drill. And this wasn't necessarily my intent, but you did a great job of interviewing, being podcasting for a long time. I will tell you, it's been a pleasure having a second conversation over a mic with you. But I think a good place to kind of wrap up, at least with me, is, I've never been afraid to try things, as long as it's fit into something that I thought I was going to enjoy and something that I felt fit into my skill set. Skydiving isn't in my skill set. I'm not going to do skydiving. I'm not going to start a skydiving company.
You might do a skydiving podcast, though.
I might. I'm sure that I've interviewed some great first responders that have jumped out of perfectly good aircrafts. It's not going to be me. But from a transition standpoint, if it fits into your skill set and it's something that you really feel that you're going to enjoy, I've never shied away from doing that. And I think from a transition standpoint, maybe it feels like a pivot. Maybe it feels like, should I really be going this far off of my original purpose or original career? Listen to that little inner voice. I've had. I look back at the last 20 to 25 years and, facing evil, doing that podcast, for example, is a lot different than running marketing for, a $5 billion financial institution. But somehow I had the skill set to be able to do both at different times in my life, and I enjoyed both of them. So you don't let somebody say, I had people say this about Podcast Magazine. It's like, well, why are you going to go write for Podcast Magazine? You've got a consulting company and you run the Police Officers Credit Union Association. How does that have anything to do with what you're doing now? It's like, I don't care. It's close enough to my skill set, and it's something that I think I'm going to enjoy, and I think that, I could possibly make money. I didn't make a dime off of it, really. It just, right idea, wrong time. But it was something that I was really interested in. I really wanted to do. And even though it didn't turn out to be much, it was something for 3 years that I really enjoyed. And frankly, if I hadn't have done that, I might not be talking to you now.
Opportunities.
Yep.
Take them when they come.
Exactly.
I appreciate your time. All the best going forward.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed talking to you and being on your podcast, my friend.
Thank you.
As always, thank you for listening or watching the episode. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to reach out on social media or send me an email. The links are all in the show notes. I'd love to hear from you. Also, if you're not already, please follow the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe on YouTube. And if you would, please leave me a rating. Ratings do 2 things. You can tell me what I need to fix or improve, and the more ratings also gets the podcast recommended to more people. Another ask, please share the podcast with anyone you think could benefit from and enjoy it. And last, don't forget, sign up for the newsletter.